afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's special edition of the Better Managers Briefing. I'm Anne Franca, the Chief Executive of CMI, and every Friday we bring you special management views about the topics that really matter. Now, today I am delighted to share with you a wonderful and special broadcast that we did this past Tuesday to mark 50 years of CMI Women. This special celebration featured two awesome speakers and very special panels. The first is the CEO of the NatWest Group, Alison Rose, who shared with us the hallmarks of her leadership journey. And the second is Paul Pullman, the former chief executive of Unilever and one of the original male allies who's long campaigned for gender balance. We will hear both of their speeches, as well as panels with CMI Women chairs, Heather Melville and Joe Moffat, and CMI's president, Lord Mark Price. It's a very special edition of Better Managers Briefing that we're delighted to share with you.
Businesses today are operating in a hugely competitive economic environment. And the simple truth is that if a business wants to succeed, gender equality is an issue it cannot afford to ignore. All the research tells us that there is a direct relationship between a diverse leadership team and improved business performance. And it is not just gender. Inclusivity is critical. Diversity of thought and removing the homogenous groupthink that is the enemy of innovation and intelligent risk management is vital if we are to remain competitive. Research carried out by McKinsey has shown that companies in the top quartile for ethnic and cultural diversity were 33% more likely to have industry-leading profitability. If as a business you care about revenue and profitability, you need a balanced team. If you care about understanding and meeting the needs of your customers, you need a balanced team. It is really that simple. The good news is that when it comes to building diverse and inclusive businesses and communities, we can all play a part, and the rewards are significant for everyone. Whether it involves making sure women have the same opportunities as men to develop their career, for example, or making sure men have the same access to family-friendly policies and flexible working, and feel just as supported to have the same access as women. Change is happening. It is clear that both FTSE 100 and FTSE 250 companies are acting. Women are rising to the top, perhaps overcoming barriers that should not have been hard to overcome, with leaders and boards who have worked hard to remove these barriers for current and future generations. And we should celebrate these stories of success, as it is only by sharing and understanding how change is made that we can achieve our collective ambition. We should not need a compelling reason to ensure gender equality. It is simply the right thing to do, as well as good business sense. That said, if businesses and governments do have any doubt, then we should remind ourselves of the McKinsey Global Institute report, which recently said that getting more women involved in the workforce could create up to $12 trillion in additional GDP globally. And at NatWest, I recently sponsored the Rose Review of Female Entrepreneurship at the request of the government, outlining the disparity between male and female entrepreneurs. This report found that helping more female entrepreneurs to thrive could represent £250 billion of economic potential for the UK. One example of how we've responded to the report's recommendation is through our Women in Business banking proposition, which contributes to our wider commitment to help create an additional 50,000 new businesses by 2023. And we now have over 600 accredited specialists among our frontline bankers that offer bespoke mentoring, networking, and professional business advice to women-led and owned SMEs. So that is a real commitment that we're making. Now, as I've said, we've certainly made progress towards achieving gender equality, both in society and in the workplace. And that is something we can all be proud of. But we're not there yet. We have significant barriers to overcome. There are socioeconomic barriers. There is a strong link between gender equality in society and equality in work. Women have 77% of the average access to financial services that men do, and that is despite women controlling the majority of consumer spending today. Low employment rates and unpaid care work, with an average across the world, women doing 3 times more unpaid care work than men. The corporate performance model makes it more difficult for women who face a double burden. 75% of men and women agree that a top-level career implies anytime, anywhere availability to work that requires sacrifices in one's family life. And mindsets and unconscious bias continue to play out, with only 43% of men in senior management positions strongly agreeing that women are as good leaders as men, versus 76% of women. So there is clearly no silver bullet here to address this complex range of challenges, but we do need a holistic approach, one where gender diversity is an integral part of our business culture, where it is ingrained in everything we do. At NatWest, for example, at the top of the organisation, we operate a formal boardroom inclusion policy, which contains several measurable objectives, targets, and ambitions. And it's a policy that reflects our board's ongoing commitment to diversity and inclusion. And not just boardroom diversity. We also have formal targets for our executive committee to have at least 30% of women in the global top 3 leadership layers of each of their business areas by the end of 2020. We chose 30% because it marks the tipping point where female contributions influence teams enough to change behaviour and culture, and that is really critical. It is also a milestone on our journey. It's only a first step to achieve full gender balance and distribution at every level by 2030. From the start, we have been clear that gender equality is not a women's issue. It is about gender balance, deconstructing harmful social constructs relating to traditional gender roles, and ensuring equality of opportunity. This means a proactive focus on increasing the number of male colleagues in traditional female roles as well, in our case, for example, human resources. We have set the tone from the top and worked with senior leaders to help create a psychologically safe culture where our people feel able to raise concerns and challenge unwanted behaviours. Importantly, we have also found enthusiastic support from our employee-led networks and allies who play an active part in promoting gender equality and the culture we need to succeed. Progress also requires persistence. It takes determined effort and time to deliver tangible, but most importantly, sustainable results. And at NatWest, we have just come to the end of our current 5-year strategy, and we're now seeing the results of that persistence and determination. Our top 3 layers of the organisation are on aggregate now 37% female, which is an increase on 8% since 2015. We've increased our pipeline by 11% to 43%, and the group overall is 50% female. Looking at the business environment generally, I do believe the future is bright and we are making progress. But continued progress, sustainable progress, will require us to remain committed, persistent, and holistic in our approach. Now, I'm delighted to see such progress of getting women on boards. I think that is absolutely critical. But we need more women in executive roles as well. They are the future pipeline for the boards. We also need more women in mid-management roles and senior management roles, more recruits, and the pull of female talent to build a pipeline. Because it is only by doing that will we create the sustainable change that is required. None of this is easy. It never has been. Back to my comment earlier of there are no silver bullets. But the costs of failing are significant and the opportunities are huge. Thank you.
We have a powerhouse panel from the CMI Women board to join me in taking some questions. So without further ado, can I first welcome back Heather Melville, who is the chair of the CMI Women Board, spending her career in banking and finance, actually working closely with Alison Rose, and now a director of client partnerships at PwC. I'm joined also by Deputy Chair Joe Abbott, who is the Director of Director of Transport Services at Atkins. Joe Moffat. Welcome, Joe, and the Deputy Chair of CMI Women. And last but certainly not least, Angela Owen, who is the founder of Women in Defense and a longstanding senior officer in the military. Welcome, everybody. So some great words from Alison. I have to ask each of you, what message resonated most with you? Let me start with you, Heather.
So I know RBS NatWest quite well, and I have to say I'm extremely proud to be associated with an organisation that put their money where their mouth is. So the fact that they are at the place where they have got 37% of women in the top 3 echelons of the organisation volumes, I think also to get anything done and to make any achievements, you have to put some measurements behind it. In the same way that we do if we're going to grow a new market, we put some tangible actions and measurements behind it. So I think it's a great achievement, but it can only do it when you've got numbers to stand behind it.
Yeah, so some excellent targets there. Joe, what stood out for you?
Yeah, so I particularly early on that bringing out that inclusivity and diversity of thought is really important, and the sort of barriers represented by the sort of socioeconomic factors as well, and how we sort of pull in the sort of intersectionality elements of the wider sort of equality, diversity, and inclusion into sort of our I suppose guiding our focus around gender, but also learning from the journey that we've already gone through around gender. And this sort of idea of having a holistic approach. The formal business target's very impressive about the progress that they've made as an organisation. And I like this idea, the focus on the sort of 30% tipping point as well, as a sort of good milestone in our journey towards a sort of 50% gender equity. So those were the elements that stood out for me.
Yeah, lots of very good stuff there. Now, Angela, what are your thoughts from that speech that Alison shared with us?
So I've written down deconstructing harmful social constructs, which really resonated with me. Family-friendly policies for all genders, not just women. I feel that a lot of women look into the corporate world, the world that is in my sector, defence, still largely run by men, and perhaps don't like what they see. And I think that men don't like their corporate world either. So let's sort out the family-friendly policies. Let's make it possible for men to take paternity leave and have the paternity pay that enables them to take the leave. So that was the thing that really resonated with me, family-friendly policies.
An excellent point, 2 sides of the same coin, men in the home and women at work. Now, we have a lot of, you're all successful female leaders. We're joined by many aspiring female leaders. What's your advice for them? How do they get to those senior ranks that Alison was sharing the data of? Maybe this time start with you, Joe.
Yeah, okay, so I guess I come at this from a sort of from an engineering perspective, as the STEM sector. So I think there's a key point around being a male-dominated industry. I've always been different, so there's a key piece around sort of understanding the strength of being different, rather than seeing it as a hindrance, see it as a strength. And so understanding that and sort of holding on to that difference, being authentic, understanding the strength that brings, but also understanding your own strengths and play to them. And I suppose my last point is around asking for help, building your network and asking for help from people around you when you need it. So those would be my bits of advice.
Absolutely. And that last point is really important. And at CMI Women, we endeavor to give you that help. Angela, what are you going to advise our aspiring leaders? How can they get ahead?
I think I would say try and get your work life, your home work balance right. And it sounds easy to say that because we all have responsibilities, we all have pressures, competing pressures on our time, whether it's work, whether it's our partner or caring responsibilities. But there is a lovely saying that Cat Little, who was Director General of Finance in the MOD, used to say, which is, me first, then you first. I can only look after you if I look after me first. So me first, then you first. That's the one piece of advice I would hang on to. I just wish I followed it myself.
What a great piece of advice. Easier said than done, right? So Heather, what's your top tip for those who want to be in that top echelon?
So this year, 2020 March, has actually reset everything for us. We're all in the same place in the terms of we can't have some people having access to the senior people. We can't have some people being off to network in the pubs or the social places they would go together, which would sometimes prevent us as women from having the same opportunities. So for me, this year has allowed us to think differently, be creative. Resilience is one of the key things that we've all had to develop. That thing around change, from suddenly thinking we're not going to the office to your office becoming your home. Everything else around parents, and I say that both men and women, having to school their children at home and at the same time run a home, look after parents and do their roles. I think those things are important. So good leadership is really important. In terms of how you lead, particularly leading remotely. A couple of points I want to finish on is using this time, as I said, it's been reset, to invest in yourself, to invest in learning something that you didn't know already. And I always say there's a power hour in every day. And that power hour we should use wisely to invest back in our knowledge so we can bring that into the work. And just to touch on the point you've made, Angela, our health is our wealth. And quite often we have not made time for our health. So being able to walk, being able to exercise, using some of that time we would travel to do that can only make our minds sharper and make us healthier. And the other thing to add with that, it makes us a leading light and an example to the people who work for us and around us.
So those are great points. And actually building on that at CMI, inspired by our immediate past president, who is Bruce Carnegie Brown, he instituted 2 hours at Lloyd's of London where there are no meetings. And we've done that now at CMI. We call it walk and talk hour. Get outside, get some fresh air, and don't be in front of a camera. So that was a great tip. You've all got loads of questions, and I want to try and get as many as possible in our remaining time. Our first question is from Joanne Oakley. And she says, what do you think the biggest barrier was to reach the position that you have? And do you think the barrier is still around today? So let me start with you, Heather.
If I'm really honest, I think sometimes the barrier is ourselves, right? Because we don't believe that we're capable of doing something. And I think that was definitely one of mine. And it took people, sponsors, to see the good in me and tell me that I could do this and I shouldn't be afraid of change. And so that's why one of the reasons I make the time to mentor other young women, because they need to see role models, understand the journey that we've been on, and know that they can get there if they want to as well. This isn't for everybody. Not everybody wants a high-powered job, but if you want it, it's there for you. And the fact that you're a mother should not make any difference to you. You can have the best career either way, but you just need to make sure that's what you want and don't stand in your own way.
Great. Jo, what was your biggest barrier?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, building on what Heather was saying around role models, and maybe the sort of absence of role models earlier on in my career represented a barrier. And I also think through that absence of role models, the sort of unconscious biases and expectations of men within the organisation and what they sort of thought was possible for a woman in that sector. I think that's changed massively in the sort of 20 odd years since I've started, but I still see elements of that representing barriers. So that whole unconscious bias piece, and just really challenging expectations of what is possible, what people want from their careers, and trying to reinforce the positive role models that we increasingly have.
Sure. And Angela, you are that rarity, a senior woman in defense. What was your barrier, and is it still there today?
So the instant response that came into my head was barrier for me. What I had to give up my career when I became pregnant. Those were the rules at the time. It now seems ridiculous, but those were the rules at the time. If you became pregnant, you left the army. And you, at the time, weren't allowed to come back in. But you know what? That barrier actually has helped me tremendously because it was so inherently unfair. It made me think about the rules for women, about how we're treated, and probably spurred me on, even though it was 30 odd years ago now, more than that. It spurred me on to do what I do now. So maybe barriers are a good thing because they do encourage you to think about them, to change them, and to sort of probably get where you at the end of the day.
Yeah, challenge and change those barriers. What a great story.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm a final year Nottingham Trent student. What advice would you give a female graduating next year into this marketplace? Jo, what advice can we give her?
That's an interesting one. I mean, I think there's a great deal of strength and advantage in being a digital native. I think understanding the sort of, where organizations need to get to in terms of how they deal with technology and their grasp of technology. And actually, as someone sort of younger within the workforce, actually you bring a lot of advantage. So sort of really engaging with that and understanding the strengths that you can bring into that place would be helpful. I think there's a piece around maybe sort of the expectations of when you start. I mean, we're sort of onboarding graduates, and at the moment have been for the last few months, and the experience of bringing in graduates into an organisation in this climate is different. So I guess being open and agile to that and flexible as needed as well would be good to bear in mind.
And Heather, what advice are you going to give the young women entering the workforce now?
Okay, they need to make sure that they join CMI Women. I'm just going to be biased and say that because that's the greatest network to help you. And you need a network to help you when you start work. And the other thing is, look up somebody who you really admire. Stalk them on Twitter, stalk them on, LinkedIn, see what it is that they're doing, what you could learn from. Because I think we're not going to have the accessibility of seeing leaders face to face as we did before. So you really need to find out what are their traits, what are they doing, how can you learn by them. The best people to learn from are the people that are out there and put themselves out there, and also play it forward. When you've benefited, remember the journey you've been on and play it forward and help someone else.
So I'm going to build what Jo said, and Heather, Maggie Buggio, who's the senior chief revenue officer at SAP, said that a young person profiled her on social media and listened to her and then sent her a whole bunch of recommendations about how she could get more involved in the things that interested her. And I know that made a really big impression, and I'm sure that she's going to reach out to that person. But Angela, your advice for these young female graduates?
Well, actually, it picks up on what your young female graduate did, the example you've just used. My advice is be brave. Mm-hmm. Be brave. You're so much smarter than you might think you are. You're so much more able than you might think you are. Just be brave and go for it. Anyone wonderful. Can be courageous for 30 seconds, and that's all most things take. Be brave.
And so I'm especially pleased to welcome one of the pioneers in this male allyship, Paul Pullman. Now, Paul Pullman is the co-founder and chair of Imagine, a social network that mobilizes business leaders to be forces for good in climate change and inequality. And he's also honorary chair of the International Chamber of Commerce. But one of the things you'll know him best for is as the former CEO of Unilever from 2009 to 2019. And he was one of the first CEOs to champion not only sustainable business development goals, but also gender balance. And probably the first in the FTSE 100 to have actually achieved that gender balance at Unilever. He is somebody I've known for decades from my time with him at Procter & Gamble, and he is an absolutely inspirational speaker and the original male ally. Over to you, Paul.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm especially pleased to be speaking at the Chartered Management Institute to celebrate 50 years of CMI Women. When I was Chief Executive of Unilever from 2009 to 2019, during this time we made significant strides towards a gender-balanced and inclusive organization. In fact, the proportion of women in management rose from 37% to about 50% globally. It was equally important for me to have a board comprised of 50% women and 50% men, which made us probably an outlier at the time, and frustratingly, this probably is still the case today. In my own experience, almost every success story involves setting targets at every level and tracking them rigorously throughout. But as Rebecca Marmer, Chief Sustainability Officer at Unilever, said earlier this year, there have been hurdles along the way, in particularly measuring the impact of initiatives to enhance opportunities for women has proven to be difficult. Now, to overcome this challenge, we need more professional managers and leaders who are committed to advancing the science of management by testing initiatives, measuring their impacts, and sharing the results for the benefit and review of others. The Chartered Management Institute, through its unique charitable mission and work with CMI Women, should continue to be at the center of these efforts. Now, today I'm proud to co-lead Imagine, which actually helps companies meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, including goal number 5, achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. Overall action to meet the goals is not yet advancing at the speed or scale required. 2020 needed to herald a decade of ambitious action, but it is fair to say that the world is not in an easy position right now. We have not yet fulfilled the promise of a world in which every woman and girl enjoys full gender equality, and where all barriers to their empowerment have been removed. In fact, we may now be even more distant than before due to the gendered impact of the COVID pandemic. Now, I was proud to help establish for the UN the He for She initiative back in 2014, because men need to be able to understand and explain clearly that supporting women does not mean that men lose out. Everyone wins from gender equality. It's as good for men as it is for women, because empowering women and girls represents probably the single biggest opportunity for human development and obviously also economic growth. Well, so my first challenge to men is to get involved for the right reasons and help others to understand those reasons. Secondly, all male managers should be dedicating time to mentoring women. If you do not have at least one female mentee, this must be resolved straight away. And since CMI has a mentoring matching service, there really is no excuse. I also challenge men to show their commitment by developing sponsorship shortlists which should be diverse and gender balanced. While spotting talent is an ongoing task, you can in fact start today by jotting down a list of women in your teams who you could support more directly. This support can be demonstrated in many different ways: advocating for promotion on their behalf, making introductions to influential people in your network, making sure they have opportunities for visible priority work, or recommending them for presentations to senior leaders or to speak at high-profile events. Look for opportunities. for opportunities to demonstrate recognition regularly, ensure women are praised and credited for their success, and for special contributions. Look for awards or rewards you could nominate them for. There are many other practical ways men can become better allies. We should be role models for flexible working and inclusive working practices, whilst challenging work practices that do not foster an inclusive culture. We need to call out microaggression, bias, and any form of marginalization. But I pose a third straightforward challenge to men. Consider how women are involved in all decision making. There's in fact no excuse for a male-only meeting to take place without the lack of gender diversity being raised and clear action to address this being taken. As a male ally faced with a situation where a decision is being made only or predominantly by men, my first question needs to be, why are we considering making this decision with no or so few women involved? It's wrong and it's bad for business. Speaking candidly, we must be aware that supporting women may become harder as greater progress towards gender equality is made. As a gap narrows, it can be deprioritized and the underlying problem easier to brush away. This year, 2020, has been so incredibly difficult for so many people. But not all of us have experienced the same level of difficulty. Ask yourself if you, like me, have been protected on an island of prosperity within a sea of poverty. Have you benefited from privileges in ways that others have not? Well, let's respond by all collaborating with optimism to create a vision for the future that includes everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now the decade for action, and we must act together. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome back, everybody. And weren't those inspirational words? And now I am absolutely delighted to welcome to the panel to take questions also from you. So put them in the chat box. First, Paul Pullman, who you just heard his inspirational words. Welcome, Paul. Then Lord Mark Price, CMI's current president and the former deputy chairman of the John Lewis Partnership, the chair of the Fair Trade Foundation and the founder of Engaging Works, as well as the former trade minister. Welcome, Mark. And of course, joining us again is Heather Melville, the chair of CMI Women. And Heather and I are going to be interviewing Paul and Mark on the importance of male allyship and how men can help in these vital efforts for gender equality. So if I may kick off with that first question, Paul, you said in your words to us that male allyship is essential. I'd like to ask both of you, first Paul and then Mark, based on your own experiences, how do we get more men to become allies?
Yeah, absolutely. There is the rational argument for that, and I think we've rehearsed that enough. I actually even feel guilty to have to explain that, but there's overwhelming, obviously, evidence that a more balanced organization in all its aspects is a more engaged organization where more people feel that they can develop themselves to their fullest potential, and obviously these companies are doing better. And the good thing now is with ESG, as we call it now, we have data coming out of our nose. So you nearly have to be daft not to buy into that. But I think what has always driven me, you need to get to the heart, it's brain and heart at the same time need to work. People talk about courage quite often and that we need more courageous leaders, but that at the end comes from the French word cœur, which means the heart. And for me, it's inconceivable that we can, as a humanity, live together long-term in a sustainable and more equitable, more inclusive way, and get to the SDGs if we don't put the dignity and respect for all at the center of that. I fight for people with disabilities. I chair the Valuable 500. I've always been an LGBT champion. And the same here when it gets to gender or the race dimensions coming in right now. unless we have dignity and respect for all and equity for all, we will not get there. So try to really get to other people that intellectually might understand it, and fortunately more and more now do understand the importance of it. You also need to get to the emotional side, or I would call it the inner core, as well as the outer core. And the inner core actually is the most important thing that drives it. The biggest bottleneck why these numbers are still atrocious, in my opinion, is this unconscious biasness, as we call it, which frankly I don't call unconscious anymore, but that's the part that needs to be worked, not the programs or the policies.
Yeah, that's a great point. Mark, what are your thoughts? How can we tap into that unconscious bias or conscious bias and get more men as allies?
Well, I've always thought of it, Anne, in terms of a process. It's about how you think, how one thinks, and then it's about the words you use, and then it's about the actions. And in my own case, I was very fortunate. My dear old dad was a preacher, and he used to say to me, Mark, in the eyes of God, nobody is better than anybody else. And then when I went to work for the John Lewis Partnership, it was actually enshrined in that business's constitution that there had to be equality and fairness to all within the business. And in fact, there's stories about the founder of the business, Speed and Lewis, at the end of the Second World War, when many capable women lost their jobs when men returned from the war. He recruited them. He just pointed out this is a huge waste of talent. And therefore, in terms of my own thought process, what I've seen is the argument for equality in every sense, gender equality, equality around diversity, etc. But once you've understood that for yourself, I think you have a responsibility, and Paul used the word courage, which is right, to explain that point of view to others and to call it out. And Anne, I thought you made a very strong point recently in an article about board meetings and men talking about football and ignoring their audience. And something like that happened to me, funny enough, when I was chairing the Waitrose board. And the conversation would always start with, how did Tottenham do at the weekend? Or what did you think of the way the rugby was played by England or somebody? And one of the female members of our board afterwards said to me, that's not a very inclusive conversation. And it really struck me, actually. And so once you've had that thought, it's then about what words you use to try and convince people that isn't right. And we said that, that's not the behavior that we would adopt. And then it's the actions, it's calling it out. So I think the process is much the same as Paul says. You've got to win the intellectual argument. You've got to have the evidence to say this is right, and we all know it is right. And you've got to, I think, also almost have a moralistic point of view that you believe it's right. It can't be wrong that one group of society has some kind of preference over another. It just can't be right. But once you've then accepted that, it's calling it out on every occasion, the words you use, and demonstrating through your promotions, through your appointments, that what you value most is talent and ability, irrespective of the gender, the colour of skin, the sexual orientation. And if leaders do those three things, then we will change things.
You both have talked about, and Mark, I've heard you say this as well, that managers' roles are to respect the needs of the individuals. And we also know that in this crisis that certain human traits, and Paul, you referenced this, like listening, like compassion, like communication, have become incredibly important. How do we ensure that we keep humanity that we've seen in leadership, that we've seen in COVID, post-COVID, and that we make it part of, the normal way of leading organizations, and we don't just restore factory, if you like, crisis is over. So how do we do that? Well, let me start.
Well, it happens to be that to be successful moving forward as companies, if you want to bring it to the private sector for a second, the skill sets that you need are quite interesting. We need more purpose-driven companies. We know that they are more successful in many aspects, including a financial performance. We need companies to think about the long term. We need the multi-stakeholder approach. So partnership is going to be incredibly important. And all these skill sets that we're talking here about, systemic thinking, if you want to, are skill sets, actually, believe it or not, that are better given to the female race than to the male race. So if any company wants to be successful long term, then I'd invest there. And I actually invest in developing those skills also if I was a man. There was a book that came out a few years ago, I just remember, which was called The End of the Era of Men. The writer escapes me for a second. But I sort of looked in it in the bookstore and I was worried about it, that this is, we're done. But if we don't adapt our way of behaving, we are done. If you look already during COVID, the countries that were most successful in treating that were the countries that actually had the highest trust factors, to be honest, with society. And these were countries run by women, the Norways, the Icelands, the Finlands, the Denmarks, the New Zealands, the Taiwans. And I think there's something to learn from this. So we could abandon it. We could forget many of the lessons of COVID. We could turn this pause into a restart of where we came from. First of all, it would be a disaster for humanity, and we'll have another COVID back within 10 years. And that is not a option that I think many people are choosing for. Or we can take the lessons and say, isn't it time that we work all together on creating a more inclusive, more equitable, and more sustainable environment and for generations to come, which goes to the essence of the Sustainable Development Goals. It happens to be that trajectory creates more jobs, creates better jobs, more resilient jobs, better social cohesion, and a world that actually we can all live in. So this is where I'm focused on with my efforts right now. And that's what I encourage everybody else to do, because it needs all of us.
So Mark, how do we get that? How do we make that the way that we lead coming out of COVID, that human leadership?
So I think that COVID has fundamentally changed the way that people will manage. From the research that we do at Engaging Business, we know that 2/3 of people are now saying they want a flexible working life. They want some time in the office and some time at home. We see that scores in terms of workplace happiness are higher, particularly around information sharing, because managers have had to give more information to their teams for them to perform their tasks remotely. In addition to which, people feel more trusted and empowered because decision-making has to be passed down. And as a consequence of that, there's been a benefit in how people feel. And therefore, I think many managers are now realizing that they can trust their people. They've had to do it for 6, 7, 8, 9 months, and they can do that. And that, coupled with this desire for greater flexibility in the workplace, will be good things. The things that are going to be less easy is the whole piece about career development, which you obviously, Anne, at the CMI do a brilliant job of. So how do you cope with career development going forward? How do you do that remotely? But I think that one of the things that I learned through my business life was the power of having a servant-master relationship in reverse. So when you are the manager, when you are the leader, your job is to support those people that are working with you to do the very best they can. That's your primary role, rather than all those people are serving you, make you look the best you can be. And COVID has done that. It's flipped it on its head, because you can't be there every day with your team, them looking after you. You have got to empower them to do a job. So I think that is a structural change that will make people reflect on how they are managing today through COVID and lockdown, and how they want to manage going forward, and how people want to be managed. So I think there are positives that will come out of this about independence and trust, and sharing more information and thinking more about individuals' well-being, all of which are going to be positive.
Thanks. Over to you, Heather.
So I'm sitting here thinking, we're with two legends who've really made a big change in the businesses that you've led. What could you share with us that we could tell our members, particularly in CMI Women, that they should be doing better to engage more male allies throughout their careers? And I'll start with you, Mark.
Well, I've always been a great believer, and I was told at an early age that cream ultimately rides to the top. And that if you focus on doing a great job, looking after your people, and your people perform, that's the very best platform to start with. I think after that, it is trying, as I said earlier, to make sure that male leaders are properly educated and informed wherever it is, through their school life, through their home lives, and when they come into the workplace, about what behaviours are acceptable and what behaviours aren't. Nobody can say, and Paul said this in his first contribution, that it's acceptable now to not treat people equally and fairly. It's just not acceptable. So having got people to accept that fundamental, it's then a question of calling it out and demonstrating actions as a leader every day to make sure those things don't happen. One of the best descriptions of culture I ever heard was it's the sediment of past transactions. And every day as a leader in a business, you are putting down sediment. You are doing things that people are looking at. And Paul said this earlier, they're either calling it out as being good and fair and open and honest, or they're calling out as being unfair, deceitful, and not trustworthy. And so every day you have a chance to create the environment that you want to create for women. And I would say that the role of women is to point out where that isn't happening, or any group to point out where that fairness isn't happening. Only through that will we get the change that we all want to see.
Thank you. And Paul?
No, I love that, Mark. The culture is the sediment of past transactions, and I might steal with pride as on panels. I just love the expression there. I hadn't thought about it, nor had I heard about it. I don't want to repeat what Mark is saying. I just want to be perhaps positively provocative to the people listening in. You're celebrating 50 years. That started with women in management. Eleanor started that. And frankly, if you look at it now, 50 years later, we cannot be satisfied with where we are. We cannot just say we have come to what we set out to achieve. And that really shouldn't be the case. So there's a level of, I think, impatience that borders on the anger, where we need to really be firmer now in calling out, just like we have to start calling out companies that deny climate change or human rights or slave labor or child labor. This gets to the same level. And anytime we see people that now willfully don't work actively to address that situation, they become complicit. And I think that is actually dangerous. And we should be really firmer at this point in time. And that's why I start to think about not using the word unconscious biasness anymore, because with the awareness that is out there, with the discussions that we all have, I wonder to what extent it is still unconscious. So this is my first point. What we did in Unilever, I don't want to rehash that, that's not important, but I do think it's the lead from the top, and too many organizations delegated to the HR department, or the CEO comes in with a little sheet where they read off the latest sustainability initiative to hire a few more women. And you might laugh about that, sadly, but that still happens in many companies. And I can see it. When you have an honest discussion and looking eye to eye with a lot of the CEOs, I wonder how many can really hold the conversation. So you need to start at the top. And in Unilever, I was always chairing the Sustainability Council, but I put people on that from senior management who had the biggest gap versus objective. And sometimes they might not have been really convinced, or they came from a culture that was different. By being responsible for the company and having to explain it to 175,000 employees, I tell you, put the ones on there that have the biggest gap and they close it the quickest. And that sends a signal throughout the organization. Then nothing beats all the programs that you need, from the flexible working to the maternity, to the paternity policies, to the mentoring programs. I don't want to go through all of them, but the book of tricks is big, and you need to really use all of them, and actually don't make them gender specific. We try to make everything gender balanced, we called it. And that's the term we were starting to use, which came from Ibera when we worked with her when she was still at INSEAD. But make everything available to everybody. That's why our maternity policy, we also have the paternity policy, and we insist on doing that. Then the next thing is obviously put some numbers behind it and start measuring the progress on the culture, including the unbiasedness that is in there. We were able to work with Iris Bonnet, I think, from Harvard, where we looked at people over a 5-year or 10-year period, how many women were promoted. So it's nice to have the story, but what is actually your track record? And we started linking that to performance. We started linking that to the opportunities to be promoted. And frankly, I didn't get that far in Unilever. I left when it was gender balanced, by the way, and our board was always gender balanced from the moment I came. But I was hoping that eventually it would lead to discussions like, if you still don't believe in it, you really don't belong in the company. And that's how you have to do it at the end of the day. Fortunately, I didn't have to deal with that. So these are some of the simple steps that you need to go through. But there is a certain nice ruthlessness about continuing to underperform in this area, and that we need to have the willingness to deal with and confront. It's gone on too long.
Yeah. So that nice ruthlessness, that's a great phrase. Now we do have some time for questions, and we have a lot of questions. One for you, Paul. From Lauren Walther, she's asking, how do we challenge gender-based adjectives? So men are authoritative, boss, for example.
I was just, my wife sent me just an article that she was reading a few days ago, and it said a lot of words that we cannot use anymore. And I felt embarrassed because probably half of these words I use, and I had no idea that they had a connotation that people took offense of. So it has become very delicate. And even with the best intentions, I would be the first one to claim not to be perfect. I think, Lauren, that the way we... let me think. I think it was Stephen Coven who said it very well in his book, 7 Habits. I don't know if you've read it, but I sort of enjoyed that book when it came out for some reason. But he said, you cannot talk yourself out of things you have behaved yourself into.
So there is a question here. There's loads of questions, but there's a question here from Francesca Essery, and she's saying, look, we know that COVID has impacted women more than men, right? Every data point says that. So, what are we going to do to fix that? How are we going to address these impacts? Mark, let's hear from you, and then Paul.
So first of all, Francesca, you're right. The data we've got is that men and women are happier at work. A year ago, women were happier than men in all the research we did. This year, men are happier, so they've increased more. There are particular things that women have found more difficult. The burden for childcare has mainly fallen to women, and that's been difficult to juggle with their working lives. And caring responsibilities have primarily fallen to women, and that, again, has impacted on their working lives from home. So you're right. What you're saying is right. It's borne out by the facts and the evidence. And I think that what has to happen as a consequence is that people just, again, have to become more thoughtful about how people fulfill their roles, the flexibility that they're allowed to do that, and the support that they're given to do that. Because if you believe, as I fundamentally believe, and I know everybody on the panel fundamentally believes, that everybody is equal, where people are not equal is in carrying some of those responsibilities out. And therefore, I think employers have to be sensitive to that. And they have to find ways of having meetings, allowing more flexibility, etc., so that people can carry out those roles. So you're right, Francesca. And what I would hope is at the back end of COVID, organisations have a review about what's worked well and what's worked less well, and they do it for the different cohorts. What you find is that younger people are less happy than older people, for instance. Younger people want to get back to the workplace. Older people are more than happy working from home. If you look at it across an ethnic lens, you find, again, different variations. So I think it's that insightful look back across gender, ethnicity, age, to work out what in COVID has been helpful and what has been unhelpful. For younger people, as I said earlier, career progression has definitely been impacted. It's hard to train, it's hard to be developed, it's hard to get on. And so there's an issue for younger people around that. So that would be my feedback. You're right. And I hope that lessons are going to be learned through a thorough review of what's worked well and what's worked less well.
So I'm going to We're coming to the end, but before we do, Paul, I'd welcome your thoughts on that last question, but I want you both to answer. It's CMI Women 50th anniversary. In the next 50 years, are we going to finally get there on this issue? Paul, what do you say?
Well, it's not a dream. The reality has to be that we cannot wait another 50 years. Obviously, CMI has many other things that it will have to develop itself in, but I hope that it can obsolete the part that focuses on gender equality well before the 50 years. If not, I'd be terribly disappointed, and then it would not be good for society. So with that level of impatience, I'll leave that. But there are other things that you need to start thinking about that probably expand to total inclusion, because I think that will be an issue that is more difficult to get out of our system in that shorter time frame. But I hope with equality that we can do it better. I also believe that it is now the time, like you see in companies, the biggest pressure CEOs are getting to change now, and certainly we've seen that during COVID accelerate, is actually from their employees. Everybody now understands the engagement score, or if they're an employer brand, or what their retentions are. And this bifurcation has been showing up even more vividly during COVID. So my point is, as we see now more employees speaking up against climate change or delivering mattresses to the borders where children are separated from their mothers, or not providing face recognition tools to the governments, employees are becoming activists. I believe in every company there is a Greta Thunberg. And interestingly, the CEOs are getting more sensitized to that and react hopefully positively to that if they're smart enough. Be your own activists in your circles and be your activists in your companies, always constructively, always driving it in the right direction, always with solutions, but speak out more. Don't be that timid anymore. One person was saying in the US with George Floyd with Black Lives Matters, there's now a whole movement coming in the US where people are saying, I am giving up my board seat, comfortably as it might be, but I'm giving it up now because I want a person of color in the job. So we need more courageous people like that, or more women on boards that say, I just demand that. I demand that that is going to happen, that these board seats are being vacated, and that we solve these issues now at an accelerated basis. I had to do the same in Unilever, where the hiring ratio for the outside, for mid-career hires, which we did about 5,000 a year, we moved that to 75-25 in favor of women. I got so many people complaining to me, and so many men saying that this was grossly unfair. Well, I thought it was grossly unfair to run a company with 100% men, and I was determined to fix that. So being a little bit more forceful now doesn't hurt us. Absolutely doesn't hurt us.
So that's a great note to end on. You've heard it here. Be nicely ruthless. Be your own activist and call it out. Great advice from two wonderful and legendary male allies. Thank you so much, Lord Mark Price and Paul Pullman, for being with us tonight. Thank you, Heather, for being such a brilliant chair of CMI Women. And let's hope we close this a lot faster than 50 years.